Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us, whether you're in Europe, as Miguel Pizarro is, in the UK, or on the other side of the Atlantic. I want to welcome you for joining us. I'll let you know that this is on the record, and it is being recorded. It will be posted on the Chatham House website, and you're free to distribute it as you like. And when we get to the question and answer period, what you can do is post a question in the Q&A box. And I will call you out, and then we'll unmute you to allow you to ask your questions. So we hope to have a vibrant discussion here. Just by way of background, the point of this discussion is to present and discuss a report that Chatham House wrote based on a meeting in May this year, a two-day meeting, private meeting, held under, of course, the Chatham House Rule, that brought together diplomats from Europe, the UK, Canada, the US, as well as experts on Venezuela and representatives of Venezuelan civil society and democratic political society, to talk about two things. The first was to talk about how the international community, together with the democratic opposition within Venezuela, can break the deadlock in the situation within Venezuela, particularly regarding the negotiations, and how potentially using sanctions as leverage can possibly bring the Maduro government back to the negotiating table in earnest in Mexico. The second purpose of the meeting was to talk about the 2024 planned presidential elections and the 2025 planned National Assembly elections, and ways in which potentially the international community and the democratic forces within Venezuela can use the European Union's election observation mission report from the November 2021 regional and local elections as somewhat of a marker to make demands on the types of conditions, electoral and even media and human rights, that should be present for the international community to consider the elections to be free and fair, and how, in fact, those conditions can serve as potentially a series of talking points on the negotiations. Now, for many of you who've been following the situation in Venezuela, you'll know that, first of all, the current Maduro government has no interest or incentives, or few, to negotiate. The economy is beginning to grow in certain aspects in a very lopsided way, particularly in the private sector. There is increased demand for oil, and the price of oil also has boosted the Venezuelan economy, as has dollarization in some ways. But of course, not everyone is benefiting from that equally. By the same token, though, in the meeting, and we've heard repeatedly since, that people are feeling dispirited within Venezuela. The momentum for popular mobilization has waned. The opposition has sort of been now on its back foot for a number of reasons. And to be perfectly frank, interest in the international community has dissipated. So the question that we wanted to bring in the discussion, and in this discussion today, is what can the international community do to help promote a peaceful, democratic exit in the case of Venezuela? Just a few points that we came up in the report. I encourage you all to read it on the recommendations. And our four speakers today will touch on these. The first is what is necessary is a coordinated and clearly communicated international approach towards Venezuela that can sort of ensure a potential path forward for both sides of the negotiations. The second, of course, is focusing a diplomatic strategy that tries to calibrate engagement, even with the Maduro government and with the opposition, and potential sanctions relief, as a way to return to the negotiating table, and to do so in a way that is with Venezuela's democratic opposition. One of the central points of discussion, and one of the points of the report, as I mentioned, is on the EU's election observation mission. We recommend that the EU try as soon as possible to re-engage on the issue of the elections, and that those points of its 2021 election report be used as potential talking points and negotiating points. Another point, and we have Miguel Pizarro, who's currently in Geneva, to talk about this, is the international community should work to renew the mandate of the UN fact-finding mission to Venezuela at the UN Human Rights Council. He'll talk about this. But for those of you who've been paying attention last week, the UN fact-finding mission issued a damning report about human rights conditions and the level of repression within Venezuela. We hope that this can continue. And the last thing that we'll talk about in the report is the need for a roadmap. We sketch out a series of steps and potential ways in which the international community can coordinate, communicate, and even attempt to leverage and pull the levers of sanctions relief to try to encourage a coordinated effort for negotiations in Mexico in a way that engages the democratic opposition within Venezuela. So without further ado, I'm happy to say that we have 4 excellent panelists today, and I'm going to raise this more as a conversation among all of us. The first is Bex Buckingham, who's the UK Charge d'Affaires to Venezuela. She's here. Javier Nino Perez is the Deputy Director of the Americas for the European External Action Service. Paula Bautista de Aleman is the Vice President of Education and Programs for Primera Justicia in Venezuela. And Miguel Pizarro, beaming in from Geneva, Switzerland, is a representative of the National Assembly. What I'm going to do is pose a set of questions. And let's begin with Bex and Javier. So Bex, we talk about the lack of movement right now in terms of the negotiations and the stalemate that we're seeing. At the same time that the UN is talking about 6.8 million Venezuelans have fled. Is there anything the international community can do now to encourage a return to the negotiating table, to try to move, to regain some momentum, and to try to address the horrible humanitarian crisis that Venezuela is still facing, despite some signs of economic growth? Bex?
Thank you, and thanks to Chatham House for putting together this panel and this webinar. I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say it's frustrating that several months after the Chatham House conference, the long-promised negotiations still haven't officially restarted, although we are aware that there are talks behind the scenes. And I think one of the things that has been really helpful to see is perhaps a reorientation of priorities in the delegation, in the opposition delegation as well, looking at the mesa social, the cuerda social. When we were at our workshop, one of the things I really emphasized and really didn't want us to forget, and Chris, you've just touched on it, is let's not lose sight of the everyday victims of what is happening here in Venezuela. The humanitarian crisis is ongoing, and I'm actually up in Maracaibo at the moment, in Zulia, to get a better picture of what is happening in border areas and what that looks like for people. But hearing some harrowing stories from mothers and children and unaccompanied minors that are have been left. So with humanitarian topics being discussed, maybe ahead of some of the more difficult political issues is not a bad way to go. And I think as an international community, we have been very keen to say, negotiate on something, get something started. I mean, if the difficult political issues are still not possible at the minute, well, let's try and move in a place that will see some benefit to the people. Having said all of that, we do still seem a very long way from reaching any agreement or hearing much agreement. When I talk to people, and in the year and 1 month I've been in Venezuela, I hear we're nearly there, we're almost there. And I'm generally an incredibly hopeful and optimistic person, so I'm there with them, that we're nearly there, and then another month passes. But I think there are still some disagreements on both sides over whose ball the court is currently in. And I think our job as the international community is to support the opposition, support the interim government, support the unitary platform in whichever guise that all comes in, but also to be talking to the current administration about how important this is to move forward.
Thank you. I want to say before I give you the word, Javier, the commitment of the international community to the situation in Venezuela is evident. Bex is in Zulia, had to rearrange her travel schedule just to be here, came with us in London, and as you just heard, speaks very passionately about her concern about the humanitarian situation. And so, we talk about a stalemate, but the interest in the people who are truly committed remains. And I think that's one of the few positive takeaways I think we all have on this. Javier, your thoughts on the international community and the situation right now?
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, and good to see you all. Listen, I fundamentally, what I want to say is that I fundamentally share the feeling of frustration that Beck had. We were in Chatham House 4 months ago, or anxious and almost thinking that something was imminent. And there's two things: there's thinking, and then there's facts. The facts is that for a year the process has stalled. It's difficult to see at this point. And as time goes by, I think it becomes more difficult what real incentives Maduro has actually to go to Mexico and do something meaningful. In the meantime, Beck said it all, we're fully back, we're fully behind the Mexico process, we're fully behind fundamental and a negotiated solution to the Venezuelan crisis. This is the big starting point. But I think as an international community, we should also maybe keep asking a bit more, and I'm turning to Miguel and Paula, what if, and I know it's a bit of a provocative question, but what if, we don't really know to what extent, when we last met, we discussed, for instance, the initiatives by the Americans to, Juan Gonzalez went there, he met Maduro, something happened there. What do we do now? You said, Chris, also as well with our own electoral recommendation mission. It's been 6 months since we published a report. Our initial position was crystal clear. Ideally, everything should be channeled through Mexico and put in there. If Mexico doesn't move, because Bex mentioned something important, it seems to me, and I think that conceptually is a logical process that maybe it makes more sense to start with social issues and then more into the political matters. But, we're 1.5 years away from 2024. So, we still haven't seemingly made meaningful progress on the social issues. When are we going to start talking about the most difficult issues? And beyond that, when are we going to be able to achieve meaningful process on the most sensitive political issues? In the meantime, I think, Chris, our big question remains, what do we do in the meantime, other than, I would say it again, express our full support to the Mexico negotiation to negotiate a solution in Venezuela. But that sense of frustration, I think, entails the obligation to reflect on the big question. And I'm sorry to be so blunt, but what if if Mexico stalls, and I don't know, and maybe this is a question more for Paula and Miguel, but is there a plan B? Let's hope we don't need to go to plan B, but what if we need to go to plan B? In my mind, as I see as an outside observer, much more so than Miguel and Paula, I would conclude that it is difficult to see the incentive that Maduro would have. If I was to put myself in his shoes at this point in time, what incentive would I have to go to the negotiation table without, and I think this is very important. I think, I don't mean to flatter you unnecessarily, Chris, but the report was really good in trying to sum it up. We need to be a bit more forthcoming in terms of making sure the government understands, the regime understands what we can put on the table. But I, for one, I think any observer don't really know what has been put on the table and what we have actually offered. So all this to say that I fundamentally share more frustration of Beck's and the need to keep reflecting and the need, I said, to hope for the best, but also expect for the worst and try to collectively decide the answer to that what if.
Thank you, Javier. Paula, a couple issues here have been talked about. Obviously, the issue of humanitarian assistance is a potential sort of common first consensus point that could talk to or lead to further discussion of the more problematic issues. But then there's the issue, as Javier was saying, the what if. What are your sense of, and what would be a plan B? Or should we even consider a plan B? Given always this sort of seems to escape, if you will, our best intentions, what can the international community do? What should we expect?
Well, hi to everyone. Hi, regards from Caracas. I must say that I have the same impression as Beck and Manuel and Javier under the negotiations in Mexico. Sadly, I would love to tell you that there are good news and that we have really great outcomes, but that's not what I can say on the information that I know. But I can talk about the work of organization and practical politics that it has been happening in our country with political activists, civil society, because the democratic platforms decide on last December, that we are going to build a path that lead us to elections, and we have to be prepared for that. And if you ask me what the international community can do under that topic, I think that the electoral mission on the European Union is very important for us, and that we have to read and make us the outcome of that inform, and to tell the dictatorship that we need more conditions, democratic conditions, so the people can go and vote. I mean, it's, in a way, it's really simple. In another way, we know that it's really complicated, but the democratic forces in the country have done this agreement on elections, on electoral path, and we have to build that way to work together to make the political conditions to achieve that goal of going on elections. And the international community can help us with this mission, electoral mission, and also making pressure and making sure that if we win that election, the dictatorship can and will accept that result.
Let me ask a quick follow-up question, Paola, because before I get to Miguel, what other avenues of pressure exist? I'm going to talk a little in a second about the sanctions, but we talk about pressure, but I think there's a certain sense that we've exhausted some of the normal sanctions. So what else is there from your perspective in terms of what the international community can do?
Well, to be honest, I don't have the answer. I mean, okay. I would love to have
that usually doesn't stop me, but go ahead.
Yeah, but I think that that's a really hard question that Western civilization and democratic societies have to face on the 21st century. How to interact with this dictatorship, who are specialists on simulating democracy and cooperating between each other. Because autocracies are really smart on having path of cooperation between them, but it seems like in the 21st century that the democratic countries and society and the Western civilization cannot find that tools to make pressures. So I don't have the answer. If I have it, I will share it with you. But right now, I only have that question that people who are in positions of power, well, can reflect on that.
If the answer comes to you, please email me and we'll make sure it gets
okay, I will.
Okay, thanks.
I will.
Miguel, I have not, same question to you. What else is left? What can be done? But taking advantage of, feel free to sort of give us a summary of what you've heard in Geneva too. I wouldn't stop you if you launched into that.
No, don't worry. Thanks. Don't worry, Chris. And thanks to everyone for having us, Chatham House, and everyone connected to this call. Ambassador Buckingham, Javier Niño Perez, and Paola, my party colleague, for being here as panelists also. I will start also sharing frustration. I believe that anyone that start doing an assessment on Venezuela and not expressing frustration at the very beginning is not doing a sincere assessment and is only reading talking points. So I'm really happy that everyone was completely honest about the frustration we feel about the current situation. I believe, Chris and everyone, that we need to make a new assessment or carrots and sticks. And that means understanding the new international context. The same incentives that the regime had a couple of years ago are not the same they have right now in the current world context. And after the Russian war started, after the Russian invasion to Ukraine, the whole context in the worldwide conversation about Venezuela have different topics. It's not only the approach about democracy. Now democracy, elections, and transition in Venezuela are also on the table with oil, liquid gas, energetic conversations, and understanding that this is the context in which we are is a first step of realistic approach to the Venezuelan discussion. Saying this, I believe there is a big amount of incentive for the regime to engage in real negotiations, seeing the energetic opportunity they have in the real market, seeing all the gestures they have done to Repsol, Eni, Chevron, and all the conversation happening with the oil companies behind curtains and all the access they are having on the regime. Of course, they are interested in having some economical and financial access. Also, the regime have only one incentive to do the 2024 presidential election in a normal, semi-clean way, that is having legitimacy. being again part of the international community, being again part of the financial community, having access, for example, to the gold in England, to the IMF credits, to the IDB, to the World Bank, and we can do a whole list of multilateral bankings and financial institutions or assets to which the regime wants to have control or access now. And those are incentives for the negotiation. Referring a little bit to the what if question from Javier, I don't believe right now is the moment to start discussing a what if, and I spoke about this before. We are in the middle of a huge effort to resuscitate Mexico. Finally, the US, the international community is aligned, giving their gestures and taking decisions, hard decisions, a lot of them, to show to the regime real political will of having an agreement. Finally, you have an opposition with all the difference we have, with all the egos we have, with all the characters you already know, but everyone represented in the delegation. We have a head of delegation that is an independent guy, recognized and respected by all the parties, but we have a delegation which is represented President Guaidó, Enrique Capriles, Manuel Rosales, the governors, the mayors, everyone in the opposition spectrum is inside of the delegation, even the minority parties and the small movements around civil society. Rebuilding this framework is not an easy task. Rebuilding this framework in the opposition, rebuilding the memorandum of understanding between the regime, the Norwegians, and us to do the framework of the negotiation is not an easy job. And that's why every time someone asks me a plan B or what if or when to start moving in a different direction, I always try to reinforce that before starting that discussion, let's try to do everything we can to bring the regime back to Mexico. And I will close, Chris, with a short comment about what's happening today in Geneva. Because what's happening today in Geneva and last week with the presentation, with the release of the report, is not something that is happening in a different world or in a parallel reality. We're speaking about the same country. This is not an autopsy. This is not a report of the closure of a moment of history. This is a picture of the present. The exposure of the chain of command of intelligence and counterintelligence, the explanation of what's happening in the mining activity in Venezuela, the presence of irregular groups, the cross-coordination between the army and the NSACs in the mining and illicit economic activities in the Arco Minero, and the whole sequence of reports. The first one saying there's reason to believe there are crimes against humanity in Venezuela. The second one showing how the justice system and the prosecutor office doesn't work to prevent a human rights violation. And now the third one in how the political executive power and the army and the intelligence and counterintelligence work as a whole to destroy the opposition and to diminish our presence in the country. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Javier, let me go to you about the international sanctions. As we know, after January 2019, the Trump administration launched a maximum pressure campaign. We've begun to see some incremental changes, particularly on Chevron, Eni, and Repsol. One of the report's major conclusions is for greater international cooperation and communication on this. Not that it means that all the countries or blocs will operate in lockstep. What's your sense, if you could imagine an ideal world, of how that could possibly proceed in terms of using sanctions in some way to, as Miguel said, take advantage of some of the incentives this government has to perhaps take advantage of higher oil prices and the need for more oil and natural gas in the global market?
It's a very this is a question, Chris, that can be seen from many different angles. Let me touch on something which is slightly related to it, which is what happened with the license from Chevron and then Eni and Repsol. We're speaking about frustration, sadness. Somewhat there is a glimmer of hope in that something happened that unblocked the process, and then Chevron got its license. So one way or another, there is the capacity of this regime to move. Now, there's a number of elements that are important in your question. The first one I think is incredibly important. We keep talking about that is good coordination among all stakeholders, and by that I mean primarily foreign players together with the opposition and others. Now, it's a fact. I'm not going to go into why decisions are taken, but of course the some of the recent US moves have been rather unilateral in the sense that they have not been coordinated, at least with us, the EU. This is public knowledge. You know, the US, and it has the right to do it, decided to go in physically, but also politically, and engage. And to some extent it worked. We still don't know the details, obviously, what was actually the result of that diplomatic activities, but somewhat it works. So that's one key element. I think we really need to keep coordinating, and our offer is there. You know, we are willing to coordinate the sanction. I think we need to be more proactive. As I said, I respect and I trust the negotiators. Our problem is that we don't really know to what extent, Chris, the possibility of lifting the sanction has been actually put on the table. So it's very difficult for us to judge the efficiency of that policy without knowing to what extent. And I appreciate that this is something that probably remains must remain privy to those negotiating, but it's very difficult for us to understand how efficient that policy could be without actually knowing to what extent it has actually been, as I said, put on the table, and to what extent the regime has been offered the possibility to significantly lift the sanction in exchange of. And this is something that brings me to a related point and brings me back to the report of Chatham House. You know, I think that our report has a value of outlining a rather clear roadmap in terms of, you know, who does what and when, in terms of the trade-offs. Now, again, we don't really know what is going on in the negotiation, and that's the name of the game, but it's very difficult to know whether this is a possible process or a likely process without knowing what happens. So to sum up, listen, let's stay with that glimmer of hope that something moved. We don't know exactly why or how, but something moved. Logically, as you say in the report, Chris, common sense will take us to the point where we assess that if we were willing to offer lifting of the sanction in a meaningful manner, probably something would move. I don't exactly know what, but for that, as I said, we need to fully understand. And this is a plea also to our American friends. I don't know if they're there. We talk to them. I'm sure Bex does too. But I think it is critically important that every single move we make on Venezuela is fully coordinated with the international community. We'll try to do the same, and I get to that in a minute when we speak about the electoral observation mission. Whatever we do will be coordinated with the international community.
Bex, your name was taken in vain there by Javier. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think it's clear that on the sanctions piece, you know, the regime's position seems to have strengthened over a period of time. Sanctions have not weakened them, and they are now, you know, engaged with their friends. However, you know, they're no longer supplying ENI Repsol in exchange for debt swaps. You know, that was quite a major concession, although perhaps in practice maybe a bit more of a weak carrot, but nonetheless a definite concession. But it looks like the Maduro administration is keen to hold out for more, and they are holding their nerve. So, you know, I think anything that the US does, and I'm sure, you know, the State Department, et cetera, are all thinking about this pretty hard, is how to use conditionality to secure concessions in this space, which is certainly the conversations I have. I mean, I think that the Maduro administration are probably fairly frustrated with their dealings with China, Iran, Russia. I mean, they have stood by them, but nonetheless, they are not the moneymaker that being able to sell your oil elsewhere really is. So, you know, what is the possibility of an alternative, I would sort of say, in that space. But, you know, I totally recognize Miguel's point around don't talk about me, we're not there yet, we're not there. But I'm with Javier on plan B. I'm like, you know, this has been going on well before I arrived in post. And so I'm a little bit sort of like, well, you know, I worry about the fact that we have presidential elections in 2024. Technically, Maduro could call them on January 1st, 2024. I know it would be unusual. I know it is historically the end of the year. Doesn't mean he can't do it according to the Constitution, or even now with the Constitution, quite frankly. You know, there's a bit of me that is like, come on, we need to see what more can be done. But we also have to recognize we're right in the middle of midterms in the US. And Venezuela and Cuba are domestic policy issues, which are without doubt influencing or being part of foreign policy decision-making when you have such a close call on a domestic policy issue.
Thank you. Paola, your hand is up.
Yes, just.
I was going to turn to you anyway, so this is perfect. Go ahead.
No, it's just a thing that, considering what Beck said about the negotiations and Plan B, I think that maybe it can be important to acknowledge that there are things that happens at the same time, that you can have Mexico running and you can have the political work doing inside the country, preparing everything to elections in the worst scenario, that I think that that's what's going to happen, that you have civil society fighting for human rights, raising their voices, and the things happens at the same time. That, I mean, this is not like a timeline that is fully direct to democracy. And considering what Javier says about that we are moving, I think the question is where we are moving to. If we are moving to a re-equilibration or autocratic resilience, or if we are moving to democracy. And our work, our democratic work as activists and politicians, is to move to democracy. And we have to be really clever and clear and professional on that work.
Miguel, I want to turn to you. Paola mentioned you, but I also want to sort of turn a little bit now to the issue of the elections, which have come up several times, and get your thoughts on what should be we have a very powerful report that the EU produced, despite a lot of concerns beforehand, but it really is almost a model in what an election observation report should contain. What's your sense of how that can be used, how that can be leveraged? You're also in Geneva right now with discussing the UN fact-finding mission, which has played a very strong role. Should that include some elements of election observation? How do we make use of the UN fact-finding mission, as well as how can we best prepare internationally with domestic counterparts within Venezuela around the elections to help, let's say, at least move it forward of the discussion?
Yeah, Chris, I will address both as separate tracks. First, about the electoral observation mission from the European Union. I believe the report they released is a key ingredient for any electoral discussion in Venezuela. And there's an important number of topics, and I spoke about this with Javier before, that can be started working, that if there's a political will on the regime side and on the CNE, there are things that can start to be done without waiting for a political negotiation or having a political agreement. Opening the electoral registration for new electors, for the young people inside of the country to be able to register, making the people able to change their residence and be able to move from one state to another and update where they are living to make sure that they can vote close to where they live and not with the movements they did in the past 3 electoral cycles. Building the capacities for the political organizations to legitimize or at least be legal again, be able to compete and appear on the ballot. There are different things that are, to say it in one way, harder, that cannot be addressed without political agreements, like the political rights of candidates to run, or parties like my party, that is a forbidden party right now, to be able to appear again on the ballot, or Voluntad Popular or Acción Democrática. Those kind of discussions needs political agreement and negotiations. But there's a set of topics that could start being addressed right now if the CNE and the regime had the will. And I believe that the report from the European Union helps to shape a non-maximalistic conversation about elections, because we are not going to arrive to a 2024 having an election like the one there is happening in the UK or Spain or in other countries. Venezuela is what it is, but we need the minimum conditions to be able to compete in an election. Now, relating to the human rights report, I believe that there's a set of things that are important also for the context of 2024. Understanding that the main goal of the intelligence and the counterintelligence inside of a country is to diminish, to disappear, to erase all forms of dissidency, all forms of opposition, all forms of organization. It's a clear reason to understand which is the playground in which we're going to fight 2024 election. This is not a fight between two irrational political parties that are unable to find an agreement. This is an election between victims and the one violating their human rights. This is going to be a political path between now and 2024 of civil resistance, of civil organization against all the tools of the power, including the intelligence, the counterintelligence, and the violence to try to silence their voices. And that's the importance of what we are doing on the humanitarian discussion. And Beck said it pretty well. Right now, there's a brutal disconnection between people and politics. There's a brutal disconnection between people and negotiation. If you go and you pick 10 Venezuelans randomly and ask them what you think about negotiation, I can assure you that 8, 9 out of 10 doesn't know what we are speaking about. So making sure that the people is in the center of the discussion, now with the humanitarian conversation, but also in the future with reparation, justice, and human rights, is the only way to make sure that also this is not a horse trading dynamic between both political elites. Because at the end, Venezuela is more than only the opposition and the regime. There's a big country in the middle that needs to reconnect with politics, that need a lot of justice, but right now also need a lot of assistance. And that's what we're trying to do with the humanitarian agreement in the pre-stage of the negotiation, and also encouraging the donor community to keep helping the humanitarian response plan and the humanitarian structure inside of the country.
Can I just one very quick, as Bex, I think, very powerfully said that could be, a relative for what, in the Venezuelan context, a low-hanging fruit in terms of then getting to other more vexing political discussions. What is your sense of that discussion right now?
I completely agree. I completely agree that starting discussing things like health, food security, water sanitation, electricity is a way easier discussion than start discussing if Guaidó, Capriles, or Leopoldo Lopez have to be a presidential candidate, how we make sure that in the transitional justice system, people on the regime side make sure that they're not going to end in jail, or people on my side is able to make sure that they have reparation and the closure of the process. Starting with humanitarian discussion and also trying to go in small steps of trust building measures. And I know this is like an endless cycle. This is like the time I listen to myself saying this, and I remember this is like my 50th time saying this, but what other option we have? And this is an important reflection for everyone seeing us. Right now, we have or the option of insisting in negotiation and make all the pressure and bringing all the carrots to the regime to make sure this works, or we can go back to the previous programming. And we can start running in circles between demonstrations, repressions, frustration, demonstrations, repression, frustration. This is also a learning process of an alternative that is working with the only tools we have.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we have a lot of questions in the queue here. So I'm going to have just a last minute round of quick answers from everyone, and then just prepare to unmute yourselves. I'm going to take the first three after we finish this round. Velisa, Humberto, and Merlin advisors. The question's this. People are beginning to worry that with the wave of elections in Latin America right now, some of the resolve is weakening to maintain pressure on the Maduro government. We can argue, Lula's changed his tune a little bit from when he was last in power. Boric and Antonio Urrejola's actually been quite clear on this. What is your sense, both in sort of, is there potentially even, could this be a positive change in terms of the scope of ways to engage a government? Does it open up an opportunity, or is this a risk? Let me go, Miguel, I know you need to leave soon, so let me ask you quickly that question, and then we'll turn to Bex, Javier, and Paola.
Thanks, Chris. And also, I believe it's useful for different purposes, same question, but the changes in the region are an opportunity. And I will give you two clear examples of that. Next week, it's going to be voted a resolution here in Geneva that is going to be presented tomorrow. Who's the core group of this resolution? Who are the group of countries presenting this resolution? It's Paraguay, it's Canada, it's Guatemala, but it's also Peru, it's also Chile, it's also Ecuador. So having governments from all across the ideological spectrum, having governments from the democratic left as Chile and Peru, having a government like the Boric government supporting the renewing of the mandates is a clear message of fighting the double standard in the ideological pendular in the process inside of the region. I believe, and we believe, that the new wave of left-winger movement governments inside of the region is an opportunity. First, to have a different relation, passing message to the regime. Second, to engage in a different way with international community. And third, to make the, for example, human rights file or humanitarian discussions have a bigger and more robust political ground. It's not the same when we do something only with the US support, Canada support, and a couple old school right-wing governments from the region than when we present initiatives like the one we're presenting in the Human Rights Council with the support of Chile and Peru. And we believe, and with this I will close this part, that governments like the Petro government have an opportunity if they know how to play their cards. The miscalculation of thinking that there's a peace opportunity in Colombia without having political change in Venezuela is a miscalculation. And understanding that for the sake of the peace in Colombia, you need a stable and democratic Venezuela, because if done, it's never going to stop being a safe haven, maybe not of the ELN or the FARC, maybe now from the Tren de Aragua. And if not the Tren de Aragua, it's going to be another one after that, because it's a model of government. It's a way of understanding power. And that's why it's so important. And the same applies to the private sector. Thinking that you can do business just by business without democratization inside of a country is a big miscalculation at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you,
and I always, it's an imperfect comparison, but obviously it took Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, and the Contadora process to bring peace to and it was in the Reagan administration. Javier, your thoughts on this?
I think, I mean, I also want to see this as an opportunity. First of all, you know, an even operational one, going back to the points Bex was making about humanitarian assistance. Now we have the possibility, I'm talking from my perspective, used, for instance, to work with both with Colombia and Venezuela on the situation of the border. You know, drug trafficking, smuggling, organized crime, the road of the FARC, of the ELN. Now we have the capacity, we have two governments at dialogue, and maybe we'll be able to implement something operational that could help diffuse the problem stemming from that conflict in the border. Now, I think Miguel is right in that we have the feeling that the new leadership coming in countries like Chile, Colombia, could be helpful in first of all, having a more assertive perspective to what is happening in Venezuela. And we're very happy with, for instance, what we hear from Boric in that respect. And that could be an interesting idea for those leaders to engage. But I think what we should actually promote is not just the bashing, of course, because this is helpful, but it's also they engage with each other. That Lula and Boric and Petro are able to speak to Maduro and to persuade him that, you know, maybe he should do things. So that is that's another way to say that the worst we can do is to demonize the regime or the administration. I think that would only turn them more and more to the arms of the Russians, the Chinese. You know, we need to engage with them. I think the report is very good, Chris, in pointing to what we call principled pragmatism. You know, this is an administration we have to deal with. There's a new leadership in Latin America and the Caribbean that can be helpful, but not just through criticizing, but also by engaging with them, by engaging with Maduro and talking to him. Which brings me to a related and a very complicated point. I know that Miguel and I have a bit of a discrepancy here in terms of Plan B or C. He pointed to the EOM, to our electoral observation mission. Our stance was very clear. We wanted those recommendations to be channeled through Mexico. 6 months down the road, we see that this is not possible. Of course, you know, we need to act on it. You know, it's only 1.5 years away from the elections. If we don't start acting on those recommendations, they're going to become useless. So this is not to undermine the Mexico process. It's about being pragmatic. I mean, whether we like it or not, the Americans have their own track. You know, call it the way you want it. But they are negotiating some things with Venezuela. So without undermining Mexico, I think we need to be pragmatic. In our case, to go ahead and try to see what we can do about implementing the electoral observation recommendations in full coordination with the unitary platform, in full coordination with our international actors. The Americans are willing and free to do something they can, whatever they want to, and if that something can lead to progress, so be it. If Lula and Boric can open a space for dialogue for Maduro, so be it. I think we need to be creative, we need to be flexible, and we need to be principled, but also pragmatic.
Look, just very quickly, I agree with both in terms of this is an opportunity, not a threat. Because the bottom line, and there's actually a question in the chat about this, we don't mind what side of the political spectrum the winners are. What we want is to see a democratic process for there to be a winner. And the left winners in Peru, in Chile, etc., won through a democratic process, through completely following their own constitution, and through allowing all of the people to have their vote, and for people not being disqualified and being allowed to run. That's what we want to see in Venezuela, is a democratic process. And if Maduro wins, then through a democratic process, then that would be great. I mean, as far as we're concerned, it's not about favoring a particular side here. It's about favoring democracy. And I think that's the point that we will continue to make. Yes, it's an opportunity. Yes, we should continue to engage. Yes, we should, work with those other governments, those Latin American governments that Miguel has talked about, who are on the left, who will be engaging with Maduro administration, and perhaps see, if they can be a bit more persuasive about the need for a path to democracy, and also using the electoral recommendations made in the EU report, because they're a quick win, if I'm honest. None of them are particularly difficult. And I think any of the left leaders who have recently been elected in Latin America would have abided by these things. The things that the EU Commission report says are things that a democratic government should want to do. So I think that's probably where we're at.
Paula, a few comments, and we'll go to the questions. And again, Belisa, Humberto, and Merlin advisors. Paula.
Yes, I also agree that this is an opportunity, and it is an opportunity because this is not about right and left. This is about democracy and autocracy and human rights or not human rights. This is not about any ideology. You can be left and Democrat and a Democrat, and you can be right and on the Democratic scoop. So I'm hope on that. And the other thing, I want to also agree with the pragmatic perspective that Javier share with us, because for the people who are in Venezuela, Mexico is really, really far. I mean, it's something that we cannot be part of. It's something that is really, really far, and there are a lot of political actors, as you said, Miguel, that we are all the representations of the political parties and civil society and blind and whatever, and all those people. But when you are here in Caracas and you don't have light, you don't have water, you don't have how to move, you don't have money, you don't have how to pay schools, you don't have hospitals, Mexico is really far. And the only thing that you have in your hands is to fight for the vote. It's the only thing that Venezuelans, the citizenship, the people have something to fight. And I really, really agree with this pragmatic perspective. And I think that is not far from principles, because to have democracy is a human right. To vote is a human right. The only human rights are not right to live or to do politics or to have secure or something. To be in a democratic country is a human right. And that's why I think the pragmatic perspective, I don't agree with that name, but that path is really important for us who are in Venezuela.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask, so we'll have Belisa, Humberto, I see you're on. Humberto, you have about 4 questions in the queue, so I'm going to ask that you only ask one, so pick your favorite. Merlin, and then I'll ask Patricia's, and then we go to Christina, Burelli, Eric, Lino, and Francisco. So Belisa. Humberto, go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Yes. Well, basically, my concern is the fact that Venezuela has huge amount of natural resources. Even the case of oil, for more than 300 years, calculated at a rate of 3 million barrels a day, which was what we used to produce back in 1986. Now, I am considering the fact that already in the past, the Brazilian President Lula talked about the possibility of creating a sort of Council of Defense of the Americas for South American countries, sorry. And also Chavez talked of something similar. Now, my great concern is a long-term. The regime right now is not politicals, left party politicals, or it's really another type of regime. This is unheard of, but they're really not important for them what tendency or what if you're leftist or right. They simply have taken power and are not willing to let it go. So I think the only way to deal with them is as if it was bank robbers that have hostages, and you have to negotiate with them, yes, but you have to show them strength. And to that effect, Venezuela and the National Assembly in 2019 ratified the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. And I think the only way to get them in the table to really negotiate fairly for a possibility of new elections, which imply reviewing totally the electoral registry, is to have a credible military threat against the regime. So my question to you is, do you foresee such a scenario? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merlin Advisors, did you want to ask a question?
Hi, Chris. Apologies, there's some background noise in an airport lounge. Yeah, I really like the title of this session, Restoring Democracy, because restoring democracy means different things to different people. I'm pretty sure Trump was thinking that he was restoring democracy when he called up Georgia to find a few more votes. I think my main question is towards the political parties on the other side, is that as much as we need Maduro to go, if he loses, there also needs to be an acceptance that he will participate in the election and he might well win. And the question I have is restoring democracy in Venezuela the same thing as just getting Maduro out? Or is it actually restoring a democratic process to which anybody can be elected, including Maduro?
Thank you, Martin. Let me just add one more question here before we do a quick round of answers. And it was mentioned that the MOU in Mexico is being renegotiated. And why the new scope, if that's correct? And what does that imply? So let's start with Miguel. Your quick answers to those questions, Miguel.
Thanks, Chris. Super fast about Patricia. No, the Memorandum of Understanding of Mexico is not being renegotiated. Precisely that kind of things is what we want to avoid, and it's completely the opposite. Sorry if my bad English gave the wrong answer. About the elections and the last question, what we demand since at least 7-8 years ago is fair and free elections. What we want is to compete in a normal election, and we want to be able to compete and to win or to lose, but in a real election. We don't want a rigged election in which the regime picks a candidate, decide who are the parties who are able to run, decided who are the electoral centers in which the people have to attend, and have total control of the process. We want a real election. And wanting a real election means that we have all the political will to run in that election and to win or to lose. And finally, Chris, because I will have to run, there's a question made by Cristina Burelli of SOS Orinoco that I want to address super fast, because I've been speaking about carrots in the comments. She say, and what are the sticks? Increasing the scrutiny about the Venezuelan gold in Europe and in the world, and making sure that all the environmental damage, the sexual exploitation, the child labor, and human trafficking happening in the Arco Minero del Orinoco have real consequences. Second, international justice or universal justice have now a list of names to start doing investigations and move forward in understanding who they are and what they're doing and what kind of links they have with their countries. Venezuela is the only country in the region with an ICC investigation currently undergoing, and that kind of process is an important process for accountability and justice at the end for the victims. And I believe, and this is my final remark of the whole conversation today, that what Javier and Bex have said about pragmatism and coordination, for me, are the two key words of today's conversation. If we can make sure that everyone and all the countries are coordinated, and that means when the US do something, the European Union knows, the UK supports, the UK is on the loop, the region is also there, things are going to work. The same with the opposition. A lot of time, the international community was asking us, where is your coordination? Where is your unity? We are working on that. And now what we want is international community doing the same. So we can have a level playing field and a regime not being able to have different channels of different conversation. Principal pragmatism is a good approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you for the good news about the report and the resolutions. We look forward to hearing the final vote. Now, please go and enjoy your fondue in Geneva. And thank you very much. Paola, your hand was up. You wanted to answer.
No, I want to say something about restoring democracy. And it's something that we have to be clear on, is that this is a fight against a dictatorship. This is not, as Miguel said before, this is people who are victims who are trying to go out from a regime that has massive human rights violations. And that's something that we have to be aware of. And the other thing is, if Maduro wins, it's not enough. He has to exercise power according to the Constitution, because democracy is not just a fair vote, it's how to exercise power.
Good point. Bex, did you have anything you wanted to add to? And also there is Humberto's question about how you negotiate with a criminal regime. If indeed, that's the definition.
I mean, two things. I'll echo the point about it's about the road to democracy. And Martin, I think we've said this a number of times. It's not about Maduro out. It's about a free and fair, constitutionally acceptable election, and then leading the country according to the Constitution. Who gets in is not the issue for us. It wouldn't be called negotiating if you didn't sometimes have to negotiate with people you don't agree with, or that you feel have done things which are not appropriate. And so, as you know, we have negotiated over the years with all sorts of people in order to benefit the majority. And I think that comes back to that pragmatism and coordination.
Thank you, Javier. And so we're going to go then to Cristina, Francisco. I'm trying to see who else. And then Lino and Eric, and then I've got others which I'll call out right before I go to Cristina. So Javier, comments.
Let me rapidly highlight something that Beck said, and this is that we don't have the choice. We have to negotiate with Maduro, whether we like him or not, for two reasons: because he is running the country, and also because, as Beck said, this is what we believe ought to be the right way forward when engaging with anyone. I mean, I'm guessing that the negotiations with the Taliban were all extremely pleasant for us, for the Americans, but yet, we do that because we need to speak to get solutions. And, that makes us, let's take a step back and think why we would treat Venezuela different than we would treat any other given country. And I think this is more or less what Bex was implying. If you want to get things right, you have to get your hands dirty and deal with them. So, this is for me, this is crystal clear. Now, Martin's question is an incredibly interesting one because it has many, many angles to look at. What if Maduro wins, but what if he loses? And maybe we didn't devote sufficient time to that aspect, Chris. I mean, Maduro cannot afford to lose in the present circumstances. He has the ICC, he has the US indictments, okay, so we organize free and fair elections and then he loses. What's going to happen to him physically? We can always talk to the former president of Honduras, now sitting in a US jail. I mean, he's not going to just run without knowing beforehand what is going to be his fate and his future if he loses. And this complicates things further, obviously. And that brings us back to the question of, how, and I think Bex made that point in Chatham House, what is our time horizon in terms of when things could be done? Because we need to fix all these questions before we actually go to free and fair elections. Is it realistic to assume once again, that all these questions could be answered before 2024. If not, and I know that Miguel doesn't like that question, but we have to ask ourselves the question, what if we don't get there?
Thank you. So before we go to Christina, Miguel's already answered a question, but I think others, and Christina's a friend, so I'll give her the right, but then we'll go to the others in the queue, but then Nicholas, Lino, Elbeck, Jeff Ramsey, and Janet. And so get ready with your questions and then we'll wrap it up. So let's go first. Christina, please.
No, thanks. I mean, Miguel answered it, I think, satisfactorily. I think it's key. You know, Maduro's getting a free pass with regard to his environmental record. And I think it's time that, you know, the world and environmental organizations really crack down on him, just like they're doing with Bolsonaro. But you don't never hear about Maduro in the media, or rarely do you hear about Maduro in the media and with environmental organizations. So I think that is a big stick, is to, you know, his reputation needs to suffer because of his environmental record.
Thank you for that. I'll let the others will answer once we take this group of questions. I will say though, Christina, we are, not that this is the solution, but Chatham House will be hosting a discussion with the OECD on their very good gold report. And the attempt is to try to create a way of tagging the gold, if you will, sort of blood diamonds, blood gold for markets internationally. So little by little, it's happening, but I share your frustration often. Francisco, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as we know, Maduro apparently, according to the U.S. authorities, was not receiving any cash from the exports to Europe that ENI and Repsol did. So that was bound to end at some point because he doesn't want to pay debt. You know, he wanted some relief, some change, but that's not what he's going to do. If he has the alternative, of course, of exporting to China, even at huge discounts, and he's having trouble to sell it. So he, of course, would prefer the alternative of exporting to the US and Europe if he has some cash. And my question is, would, first of all, Maduro accept, instead of receiving cash, that a humanitarian program is implemented that, you know, he doesn't directly control, but, you know, it's like a UN program? Or alternatively, will the US and the Venezuelan opposition accept that Maduro gets some cash from the export to Europe and the US? Thank you.
I have a sense on that, Francisco, that Miguel would have been best positioned to answer that, but unfortunately he's left. Eric, please go ahead.
So, hi everyone. My name is Eric. Studying my master's in diplomacy and international security in the University of Strathclyde. So mine is just a parting shot whereby I can say that so far the question has been how far the EU will go to support the Venezuela opposition against the regime, sparking debates about who is democratic and who is not, and who should decide. Instead, I believe that a framework for peace, mediation, and conflict resolution will allow the EU to concentrate on the dynamics of the political conflict, also the major stakeholders' interests and values, and also the question of what a promising process of negotiations toward an inclusive political settlement could look like. In conclusion, I would say that as the European Union's official concept on peace mediation puts it, mediation requires being open to speaking to all peace and conflict stakeholders whose positions have a bearing on the prospect of sustained peace. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Lena.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a bit of off topic, but what do the panelists think will happen with the interim government in January 2023? Yeah. As the previous lawyer for the country, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, has said that it will disappear. So do you think it would disappear for sure? And if so, what options do the US, the EU, the UK have to deal with the fallout? Because the way the opposition is today is fully dispersed, and at least through the interim government, they have a sort of a head that represents them. Thank you.
Let me take the rest of the questions so we can just get through. And then there are a couple anonymous ones too. Nick, why don't you go ahead, Nicholas, please?
Thanks. Great discussion. I have a question, of course, more for the US. They kind of suggest to start discussing the implementation of the EU electoral observation mission report. And I was wondering, like to start discussing that, it's a separate track of the Mexican negotiation. I was wondering how to do that when the key recommendations actually concern key aspects of the negotiation in Mexico. And I will just mention one example, the independent judiciary. So I don't see.
We can't hear you, so what I'm going to do is just read your question. I'm sorry, there was a buzzing, and I know. Basically, the question was, how is the EEAS proposing to use we've talked about this, the European election observation recommendations independently for the negotiations. Let me just quickly take Jeff's question, and then and Janet, and I know you need to go, Paola, and I'll give you the first word if you can. So Jeff, quickly.
Sure, thanks. No,
Thanks,
just to say, you know, I think this report's very valuable. I'm just wondering if the panelists could speak more on the way that the U.S. could give a boost to the opposition negotiating team, the actual team led by Gerardo Blade, that's working in these day-to-day talks behind the scenes to get the Mexico negotiations process up and running. Is there a way that the U.S. Can more publicly support them or give them some kind of a boost vis-a-vis other opposition political actors? You know, is there a way to make it more attractive for the regime to speak with them and give them more of a public support? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Janet, quickly, and then Paola, Javier, and Bex.
Yeah, quickly. How can we read the reopening of the technical office of the United Nations in Caracas?
Yeah, the UN, that's a good one. Paola, let's go to you.
Well, there's a lot of questions. My final, sadly, I have to leave early. Sorry.
It's not early, you're on time actually, so we'll be quick.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think that the message is that we have to be clever and take advantage of all the scenarios that we have on the table, negotiations in Mexico, organizations of political parties inside the country, the work of the civil society, and to find path of coordinations of these efforts. And what the international community can do, well, they can make diplomatic pressure. I think it's important to have communication with the dictatorship. I think that what Javier said, to have good relations and to show them that there is a tomorrow after losing the power. I think that that's very important, and to have Venezuela in the top of mind of the international forces. And well, thank you very much for this event. Sadly, I have to leave.
No, we've gone over. We had a lot of questions. Javier, just some final remarks as it touches on the EU, and also maybe if you can comment briefly on the UN, although I realize that's not your remit.
On our electoral observation mission, it's relatively simple. There are 23 different recommendations in the report. Some of them are indeed very political. Some of them are more of a technical nature. When the report was published 6 months ago, and in agreement with the unitary platform, we agreed that we would try to channel the work related to the implementation of those recommendations through the Mexico talks. Now, 6 months down the line, we haven't been able to put those issues on the table of the Mexico talks. So now the idea to explore, I don't want to say an alternative channel, but a parallel channel, done in coordination with those in Mexico, done in coordination with the rest of the international community, to start discussing with the government the possibility of the least political recommendations. Of course, getting to the end of that, the recommendation report will require difficult political negotiations, but our take is that at least we should start with sort of the low-hanging fruits, the recommendations that are more of a technical nature, and see how we progress. That's on our own activities, Chris. And on the US, listen, it's not up to us, obviously, to decide. Our problem remains is that we don't really know to what extent the negotiation team in Mexico has a strong mandate from the US to actually leverage those sanctions. You know, I hope I want to say that this is the case, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. But obviously we don't really know what is the mandate of that negotiation team.
I'll just end on that note. I mean, one of the report's primary points of emphasis, and Javier mentioned, is the issue of coordination, communication. And sometimes the communication, for reasons that these are negotiations, not everything can be done transparently, but I think there are some gaps, and I think it's worth pointing out. And I'll end on this other, actually, two Javier notes. It's not just because you're the last one here, Javier, which is we need to be principled pragmatists. And I like that term. I'll end the meeting on that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Javier. Bex had to leave, Paola and Miguel. But again, it's rare that you can be optimistic on Venezuela, but at least I think we're walking away from this a little bit more positive in some ways. So thank you, everyone. Please, we'll all be in touch. More to be continued. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you, Javier.